Hi, I'm Kira, and this is my Picture an Ecologist project. I did Mark C. Urban. He's a biologist right now. He is a professor at the University of Connecticut. He got his bachelor's from Muhlenberg University in environmental and political science, his master's from Yale, and his PhD from Yale as well. He is also the founder and director of the Center of Biological Risk. He was named the first Arden Chair of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and was also in 2016 the Presidential Award winner for the best paper published in the American Naturalist, which was the evolution foraging rate across local and geographic gradients and predation risk in competition. His specialties are predictive modeling, ecoevolution, climate change, and extinction risk, and biodiversity. Specifically, more so the use of trying to predict how genetic variation is either impacted by climate change or how genetic variation is going to lead to, say, an extinction of a certain species based on how well they are like they can adapt or something like that. Well, not something like that, exactly that. And how that biodiversity and their variation and evolution contributes either to climate change or how it may be further impacted by it. His methodologies are studying salamanders right now. That is an active study going on. Specifically, how it's differentiated across small spatial scales, and then also the relationship between prey and predator, and then again uses genetic evolution and variation with his predictive modeling and how that all works in hand with climate change or different populations and communities, and then also studies local microhabitats and geographical changes. So he's studied ponds, lakes from all the way up the eastern coast, also some in Alaska, surprisingly enough. His contributions are working with a team of other researchers to try and produce models for predictive climate change. Again, how either patterns in species and their genetics or how their populations have changed and maybe predicting how climate change will progress further on in certain areas or just how climate change overall will impact certain species to either put them on conservation efforts sooner or how their genetic variation is just impacted by either population changes, and then again recognizing genetic variation and how they impact how well they can adapt to certain habitats or environmental differences. Defining the gap between evolution and ecology, which is part of his study with the salamanders, and concentrating on one or the other and how we might be missing key processes in that structured like natural communities. And then specifically, one of his older studies is how urbanization affects the evolutionary progression in smaller populations. Specifically, in this study, it was the eastern gray squirrel and how urbanization affected their population and how it affected their genetic variation. Another thing that he did was how communities changed due to new species moving into territories or habitats and how it changed competition, which would again affect the plasticity or the adaptation of the species specifically. Whether a species was able to adapt to having to compete with a new species and if it had any impacts on their genetics or how they adapted and how they evolutionized, I guess. And I chose this researcher specifically, mostly because of his studies on urbanization, how it affects populations. I think it's really interesting on how, like, something as common as urbanization affects something as common as the population and species of squirrels, because I feel like I see squirrels everywhere. And so it's interesting to see how that urbanization affects them. And then also, if we're able to predict how species will respond to climate change, how we can protect them and avoid putting species on the at-risk list or almost extinct list. So, yeah.